Welcome to today's session on the art of teaching yoga. My name is Wenlin. If this is the first time we are meeting, I'm a yoga instructor and yoga educator based in Turin, Italy. So today's episode is focused on the 5 major sequencing errors that you might already be making in your classes and how you can go about avoiding these sequencing errors. If you're tuning in, please drop a comment, say hi, let me know where you're tuning in from. And today's session is more of really a dialogue and a Q&A. So if you're tuning in live and you have any questions with regards to sequencing, if you're encountering any difficulties, any areas of doubt, please, you can feel free to share them in the comment box and I'll be able to answer them as and when I see them. Okay, so let's get started. So with regards to sequencing, there are 5 main areas we will be talking about. And the first one looks at the beginning of the class. So feel free to leave any comments or questions as I go along. Today's session will be a little bit shorter and I'll try to move through these points as quickly as possibly and also really answering all your questions. The first part, when we think about sequencing a class, is at the beginning of the class. One of the potential mistakes that you might be making is you might be sequencing in something that is very complex or a little bit too slow for the beginning of a class. So with most classes, for example, whether or not it is a hatha yoga class or whether it is a vinyasa sequence, right? The point of the start of the class, after you get your students to center into their bodies, maybe do a gentle body scan, is to really begin to mobilize the different joints in the body and to warm up to get the energy flowing, to prepare and to set the tone and the pace for the rest of the class. So what you want to avoid doing in the first 5-10 minutes of the class is to make things too slow or too complex, something that has a setup that might be too complex, for example using many props, or maybe a pose that is too complex, or some series of movements that are too slow and very low energy might not be so great, because at the beginning of the class most of your students will be wanting to move and you want to help to get them into their bodies to begin to mobilize and connect with the breath and start to flow so that they can then slowly build up momentum towards the center and the peak of your class. So think of it as, for example, a story that you are writing. The beginning of the story that you are writing, if you are a writer, whether fiction or non-fiction, has to be enticing enough and captivating enough such that your students will feel like they want to continue the class, and there's this continued energy and this arc that will draw them in towards the class and the rest of the class as the energy continues to rise. So this is the same even, for example, if you teach a hatha yoga class as well. So this is why very often you might see in a hatha yoga class somewhere in between maybe the first 1/3, right, towards the end of that 1/3, you will see sun salutations being practiced. And this is a great way to begin to mobilize the major joints inside the body to warm up your body. And one tip here is, if you're doing sun salutations for your students and they're already regulars, you might want to change up the sun salutes. So instead of having a regular sun salutation, maybe you can add, when you come into Anjaneyasana, as you exhale, place both palms down on the ground, keep the left palm down and then come into a gentle twist. So this adds rotation in the spine, because for sun salutation, this mobilizes the spine into extension, which is the back bend, and flexion, which is forward folding, but it doesn't take the body through into twists, which are the other 2 ranges of motion. Neither does it take the body into side stretches, which is lateral flexion. So this is a tip and something you can work into. So let's recap the first point. The first point is, in the beginning of the class, you can spend some time centering and grounding your students to let them connect with the breath. But once that is done, once that connection is established, you want to make sure that you give them something to begin to mobilize and energize their body so that you draw them into the arc of the class and into that energy for the remaining part of the class. All right, so let's move on to the second point, and I'll be checking from time to time to see if you have any questions about the points that I mentioned. The second point I wanted to talk about is that you may be encountering some sequencings, or you may have planned a class in which you teach forward folds at the beginning or near the beginning of the class. So in general, seated poses are a great way to begin. So very often you might see most yoga classes begin in a seated position, and that is perfectly fine. It actually allows for grounding, and most people, whether or not you teach a morning class or even an evening class, and sometimes even an afternoon class as well, people really want to sit down and they want to just take a short break first, and you can allow them that short break. But when you teach a seated forward fold, this requires a lot of openness in the hips and the pelvis, and it requires very good spinal alignment to have this seated forward fold. So therefore, it's not recommended if you teach a seated forward fold at the beginning of the class. You could teach that towards the middle or the end of the class. And also we know energetically forward folds are a little bit more calming and soothing, and you want to keep the energy more towards the end of the class when you're guiding your students towards the Shavasana. So this is the second point. You want to avoid teaching anything that might require a lot of openness in the pelvis. So the warm-up movements can be very fluid, very flowy, but they shouldn't require very deep, for example, folding forward movement. And you want to save that more towards the middle or at the end of your class. All right, so I have 3 more points I want to share with you guys. The next thing looks at sequencing backbends. So many of you may want to incorporate backbends in your classes, and I think in one of the earlier episodes, either the last one or the previous one, I think it was the previous one, we talked a little bit about the energetic effects of various poses, and many of you who tuned in had questions about backbends, because energetically we know that, you know, in probably your 200-hour yoga teacher training, you have learned that backbends are very energizing for the spine because you're extending and opening the front channels of your body, whereas you're contracting the muscles along the back, which is indeed true. But not all backbends are made the same. And most backbends actually require not just the flexibility and openness in the chest and the shoulders, but also in the legs, in your thighs. So I want to advise you to think about, for example, when you begin to sequence a backbend in your class, have you set up the preparation to bring and to guide your students towards that backbend? So let's have a look at Urdhva Dhanurasana, which is upward facing bow or wheel pose. Right? In that pose, right, you are completely inverted, you're upside down, using your hands to open and push against the ground. So you're moving against gravity. So it's both an inversion as well as a backbend. And it requires a huge amount of flexibility and openness in your thighs, not just your upper back, your shoulders, the front of your chest, and your arms, for example. So all this preparation needs to be done before you actually guide them into Urdhva Dhanurasana. And you can do this progressively by adding thigh stretches to help to open and lengthen the front of the legs, because the quadricep muscles and the muscles, the hip flexors, for example, are very crucial here in helping your students have that flexibility and that openness to come into Urdhva Dhanurasana. Many of your students, for example, if they have tight hips, hip flexors, or if they have tight quadricep muscles, right? For example, some male students may not have that wide degree of flexibility in their legs. So one thing you can do to set up is, this is already done and answered in sun salutations. If you think about it, when we do sun salutations and you step one leg back and one foot is forward with the front knee bent, what you're doing is you're contracting the muscles along the top of that front leg, whereas you're lengthening the quadricep muscles and the hip flexors along that back leg. So this is a great way to begin. And if you want to add on even more, you can come into a lizard stretch, so you can get your students to come down to their forearms, maybe reach back and have their hand reach for the toes, and they can float the foot of the back leg up, and maybe they can come into a quad stretch from there. Other ideas could be, you could sequence and include poses like dancer pose, right? It's a standing balancing pose, which is great for strengthening. And then it adds that quad stretch, that hip flexor stretch, which is perfect if you're then sequencing and guiding your students towards that Urdhva Dhanurasana. And that also helps to prepare the body for the back bend in the spine. And it's a little bit more, how would I say, because it's asymmetrical, it allows the body to do one side while the other side is a little bit more neutral. So it's not as strenuous or not as taxing on the body, and it allows more time for setup. Okay, let's look at the next point. So the third point, let me recap, is not doing opening the body fully before you move into very wide ranges of motions, whether or not that's back bends. And I use the example of back bends. The same would happen for forward folds as well. For example, for Paschimottanasana, forward folding. So one great thing about sun salutations and why often sun salutations are practiced in the beginning is not just because it mobilizes your spine and helps to get the energy or the prana flowing in the body. It takes your body through the major ranges of motion that are required. So when we walk, we are flexing and extending and flexing our legs. And also, for example, the most ranges of motion that we would require is to bend down and pick up something. And that's what we're doing in a sun salutation. So when you fold forward in sun salutations, if you want to prepare your students to move towards something like Paschimottanasana, which is a forward folding pose in which you are seated on the ground, your legs are extended forward. Maybe you begin with staff pose, and then you begin to fold, guide them to fold their belly towards the thighs. What you can do in the beginning of the class is when you are guiding them through sun salutations, get your students to use a block underneath their shoulders. Right, inhale, push against the block, lift and lengthen the spine, exhale, forward fold, and get them to move through a couple rounds of half sun salutations instead of the full salutation. Because for a lot of students in the beginning of the class, they won't have that range of openness in both the front and the back of their bodies. And many students, in order to get their palms to come down to the ground, will compromise by rounding their spine a lot. And this will actually tax their spine and cause unnecessary, perhaps pain sometimes in the spine without having good alignment. So you want to keep, use as many props, modifications, adjustments, or smaller bite-sized variations of things like sun salutations to guide your students progressively into the pose. So going back to the point, if you're guiding your student towards Paschimottanasana, you could consider at the beginning when you're doing sun salutations to use half sun salutations and use things like props so that they can have something for their palms to rest on instead of resisting and really wanting their palms to come down all the way to the ground, especially if that is not within their range of motion. All right, so let's look at the fourth point. So this point is one point that I made as a beginning yoga teacher as well, which you might also be doing the same. So in yoga, many a times when we talk about sequencing, probably in your 200 hour, you might have heard from your teacher that counter poses are important, which is indeed true. So for example, if you do a very deep back bend, if you do a series of back bends, you want to balance it out with forward folds later on. The same with twists. If you twist in one direction, you want to balance the body out by also twisting in the other direction. Of course, there are some exclusions. For example, if you're doing privates and you're working with someone with scoliosis or someone with injury on one side of their body, like for example, a shoulder injury on one side, then that might be different. But in most cases, yes, it would be important to balance out both the front and the back, the left and the right, and then also laterally, right? All of this. So counter poses are the reason why we do this, because we want the energy towards the end of the class to be more balanced, and you don't want to leave your students feeling overly energized or overly more restorative or soothed or low in energy when they are done with the end of the class. You want to find that in between, which is kind of like samana. If you watch one of the earlier episodes, we talked about langana, brahmana, and samana. In the end, most of the time, the goal is to reach that state of balance without over-energizing or over-dampening or reducing the energy in the body. But one mistake that many beginning yoga teachers may make is to sequence a huge back bend immediately with a very deep forward fold. So one example I can give is, if we think about Dhanurasana, let's go back to the example of bow pose, upward bow pose or wheel pose. Very often what happens that you might hear is, after a teacher guides a student into upward bow pose, right, the full variation of a bow pose, the option offered or sequenced after that is to get the students to come down onto the ground and hug the knees into the chest. Usually this may not cause, for some students it may not cause an issue, but this takes your student through a huge range of motion, both in the back and then in the front. Think about it. In Dhanurasana, what is happening is your back muscles are contracting a lot, as well as your gluteus muscles, your buttock muscles, the backs of your legs, and then the front, the entire top and the front of your body is lengthening, all the muscles. So once you release from the pose, if you don't allow some time for the muscles to gently come into its normal length or its normal state, and then you immediately follow by contracting in the opposite direction, this may cause muscle spasms in some students, especially if the pose itself already brought them close to the full range of motion or beyond their full range of motion. This is why it's important, if you have, for example, a very deep back bend, or for example a deep forward fold, the same, right, to allow some time for a more neutral position in between. And the same happens not just for example, a hatha yoga or vinyasa yoga class. The same would also apply to a yin yoga class if you're teaching a very deep back bend. For example, cobra, or even seal pose, where you press the palms and you really extend the spine all the way towards the sky. Instead of getting students to then immediately round the spine in child's pose, maybe you can get them to come into crocodile pose, in which they gently release the forehead on the ground and rest the forehead on both of the palms with the elbows bent, and just stay and let the effects and notice any lingering sensations or the ripples of the back bend. So if we go back to the Dhanurasana example, right, you're moving your students or guiding them towards upward like wheel pose. As they exhale, you can guide them to come back and lie on the ground. What happens is, some more experienced yoga teachers may allow students to stay with their knees bent, with their back against the ground, and to feel and to soften into the spine, allowing a more neutral spine first. And then from there, to offer options depending on whatever the student feels best for them. Various options could include just simply staying with the back in a neutral spine, a neutral curve against the ground, the knees bent, feet on the ground. You could get your students to widen their feet, walk their feet a little bit further apart so that it's mat width or even wider than mat width, and let the knees knock in, so there's a little bit of internal rotation of the legs, your femur bones, and also a little bit scooping in of your sacrum, your tailbone. So this is a very more gentle way of slowly reversing the effects or balancing the effects of that very deep back bend. And then of course, if you would like, you can also then offer the option, if they feel alright, they can then hug their knees into their chest, and then that would round the spine. So this is something that's very important to think about, especially if you're teaching a group yoga class. You want to offer some modifications or various options so students can choose whichever works best for them. And as you do this, as you offer options, you begin to make the class more accessible, and this helps to normalize or really give the feeling that the class is more of an experience rather than poses to be accomplished, shapes to be formed with the body. It's more really about using the shape to get into the body than using your body to get into the shape. And we do this by really honoring our students, our clients, where they are using these options, using these more neutral variations and offerings that they can always choose from or go to. That's a little bit gentler on the spine, gentler on the body. Okay, I'm going to have a quick look to see if anyone is tuning in live and if anyone has any questions. Okay. All right. Hi, Maria. I've seen you're tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. All right. Okay. So the last point I wanted to share, actually, there are a couple more different points, but let me just quickly summarize them. And also, I want to keep to the timing for today's episode. The last one for today is really talking about these counter poses and all that, is not thinking about your transitions. And not spending sufficient time in between the transitions. So this is one mistake that us as yoga teachers may make, and we may spend too much time on, for example, a peak pose, or working students towards more difficult or challenging poses. But the transitions are very important. Just now I talked about if we do Dhanurasana, right, in between, after Dhanurasana, what is your goal? Are you going to get your students to then come into Apanasana, which is wind relieving pose? What transition do you then offer them that's a little bit more neutral and a little bit more gentler on the spine before you get them to move into a different shape? The same occurs, or the same would apply in any different part of the class. Let's say you're sequencing to move from Malasana, which is a deep squat pose, into maybe Bakasana, which is crow pose, which many of you may sequence as a peak pose for your class. So how do you then transition? You want to think about offering options, and you want to make the transition as smooth as possible, so that, for example, your students are not scrambling to get the props, they are not on the wrong side of the yoga mat. Everything should be already thought about in the beginning. So for example, let's think about Malasana. If you are guiding your students to work progressively towards Malasana, what might you need? So Malasana, right, is a deep squat in which there's the legs are your legs are externally rotated, right? The palms are ideally close towards the heart center, and your elbows or the sides of your arms are pushing against the insides of your legs, and you're dropping your tailbone towards the sky while reaching and lengthening the crown of your head towards the sky. Sorry, the tailbone to the ground and the crown of the head towards the sky. So all of this is going on, and it requires a lot of flexibility and openness in the hips. So if we go back to the previous point, right, and we think about modifications about props, very often, right, to move into this pose, to transition into this pose, what students will require is support. How can you build in transitions that are a little bit more gentle to them, so that it's not a sudden abrupt change? Maybe say you're in Warrior 2 and then suddenly you come into Malasana. You want to think about, okay, if I need to open the pelvis a lot, right, at that external rotation, what can I offer students? And what if you teach a group class or even a private, and then you find out that the student doesn't have that degree or range of motion for Malasana? What can you do? What can you offer? So you can begin with different progressions. So let's say if we go back to Malasana, a milder version of Malasana would be something like goddess pose. So goddess pose is with the knees bent, the feet turned out roughly diagonally at 45 degrees. Really depends. It could be 60 degrees, it could be 30 degrees, depending on the openness of your femurs in your pelvis, right? So what you could do is you could get your students to already sequence that in the class, so that during the middle part of the class, your students would have a couple of times to sit and come into the goddess pose, right, with the feet, set them up into the feet for goddess pose, and then get them to bend their knees and lower, and maybe straighten and lower a couple of times, just getting the leg muscles to begin to feel the range of motion and be comfortable with testing the waters, and then gradually to move deeper and deeper and deeper. So this is the goal of transitions, and the transitions have to be very intentional as well, because if your goal is Malasana, then that is what you should be doing. And then if you have a different peak pose in mind, your transition might be different. So let me give you another example. If we are thinking about the pose such as Bird of Paradise. So Bird of Paradise is a balancing pose. You are balancing on one leg, right, with your foot on the ground. If you are doing the bind, you would have one arm underneath your thigh of the other leg that is not on the ground. and then it might be, your fingers might be interlaced behind your back with your leg underneath and the other leg that is not on the ground pointing up towards the sky. So it requires strength and openness in the standing leg, that grounding force, as well as a lot of openness in one side of the leg, the underside of the legs. So what you might do to help to transition towards, right, bird of paradise could be things like lizard pose, lizard lunges, right? You get your students to come into Anjaneyasana, and then from Anjaneyasana, low lunge, you get them to slowly test the waters by rocking forward and back. Maybe they can use props. If that's within their reach, they can come down onto their forearms with blocks underneath, or even further without blocks underneath. And all this should be done progressively. So Vinyasa Krama is this gradual building up and this leading up to something. Just like if we go back to the metaphor of telling a story. Right, in the beginning, the first point I mentioned was you want to entice the reader, entice your student or whoever it is you're guiding, your client, so that they are sucked into the story, and then you guide them as the story reaches this, follows this curve, this arc, all the way to the climax of the story. And then there's this huge reveal, and this huge reveal can be likened to the peak pose or whatever bhavana or whatever thing you want your students to be guided to feel, to experience in their bodies. So it cannot be an abrupt, sudden change. This transition has to be more gradual. So when you do any of the poses, right, one major point is, how can we know if the transitions are good? Think about it yourself. Whatever class you are sequencing, right, try to do it yourself first a couple of times, at least once, to run through it physically, right, and to do it like how your students might be doing it. Many of them may be coming from, for example, after work, they may not have warmed up their bodies. So you have to think about, okay, what scenarios would they be doing it in, right? Also, if this is an early morning class, maybe they would have slept for an entire day and not had much time to mobilize or to move and clear all the fascia, which has formed a thick web over the 8 hours that we've been sleeping. So you want to consider all these things first and make sure that you set up enough in the beginning of the class, transitioning progressively and guiding your students all the way towards the peak pose or whatever review, whatever grand finale it is you have in mind. All right, so if the transitions are not done well, this is potentially what happens. A lot of students get injuries from their yoga practice by attempting a pose that is requires very deep opening in the pelvis, in the shoulders or something before they are ready. So let me go back to the example on Malasana. So just now I mentioned that for Malasana, if you're using that as a peak pose for Bakasana, right? So Malasana, to prepare for that, you can do goddess pose. You can sit even lower. You can get them to do pulses, right? Pulsing up and down, which is kind of like squats, but wide-legged squats. And then you can use props. So always think about how you can help them to transition towards the ground, because goddess pose is a standing pose. So the pelvis is still elevated from the ground and it's quite a long distance from the ground as well towards Malasana. So what props can you use? I was just speaking to one of the students that the teachers that I mentor, and she was going to sequence Malasana as her peak pose. So I give her some advice. You can use blocks, for example, and get your students to already prepare the blocks at the beginning of the class. Say that, you put it there right next to you, and then as you're cueing them towards Malasana, from goddess pose to Malasana, before they move into goddess, you should already cue for them to have the props by their side. And then when you guide them from goddess pose to squat even lower, you can then say, oh, now allow a guide, bring the blocks close to you. We're going to be using the blocks, and there might be 3 ways you can use the block. For example, you can sit on the block. This is the best option, right? And with the palms in the heart center and with the elbows, as much as possible, helping to open the legs. The next option could be placing the blocks underneath the heels. And this would be perfect for any of your students who, for example, the range of motion in their ankles, doesn't allow for the heels to come down towards the ground in a squat, right, in Malasana or even in Skandasana. So these are all possible variations. And of course, the last one could be you could just simply have the block in front and your students could use that as support with the palms so that it allows them to keep the spine upright. So these are actually all transitions. They are all ways that you can progressively guide your students towards the peak pose. All right, now if we talk about Bakasana, there are many other different ways of doing Bakasana also. So it doesn't have to be that the full variation of the pose is the peak pose. You could simply get your students to get the feeling of beginning to transition the weight forward towards their palms. And that could be what the goal of the class is. And that is, in essence, also a transition. So that in your next class, then you can build on that. So have a think about all these points, about transitions, about sequencing your poses, using counter poses, about the arc, the energy arc of your class, as well as many other different points that you might be missing out in your classes as you're sequencing them. With this, we've come to the end of today's episode. I'm going to quickly see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so it seems like no one has any questions. All right. So here I would like to make a quick announcement. I'm really excited to share with you that I've managed to interview another expert. Right, this is Dr. Eleanor Criswell-Hanna. She is one of the early pioneers of somatic yoga, and I'll be sharing more about her work in an upcoming expert interview, which will be scheduled for next week. So please stay tuned for that next week. And also shortly after this, I will be putting up a poll in the group chat. Sorry, not in the group chat, in the private yoga teachers the group, so that you can vote for upcoming episodes. And also please share with me, what are the information areas you would like to explore. What areas are you facing difficulty? What would you like more support on? I would love to hear from you. So this way, I can be supporting you with more useful information that will help you teach better and help your students feel a little bit more beneficial in their health, and also they can advance their practice. So thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it was useful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave the comments. If you're watching it on replay, also just let me know. If you're feeling a little bit shy and you prefer to drop me a private message, you can do that as well. We'd love to hear from you. So take care and have a great week ahead. Happy Thanksgiving to those of you who are in the US, in Canada. I hope you have a great celebration surrounded by family and friends. And please stay safe and well wherever you are. See you soon.